Good evening. My guest this evening is Jean Auel. She is the author of Valley of Horses and Clan of the Cave Bear. She is a best-selling author. She is new to the literary scene, but she came on with a bang. How many books printed in the first printing?
For Valley of Horses, there were 100,000 in the first printing. The last I heard, it's up to 290,000 in about 10 printings.
And this is hardback at $15 a copy?
Yes, or 16.
And the New York Times bestseller list?
Yes.
How many weeks?
I think it's about 14, 15 weeks now.
In number 2 or number 3?
Yes.
Yes, incredible. Your first book, how many copies of, now, your very first book ever?
The very first book, the very first anything that I ever had published or wrote in terms of fiction. The first book, it has about 130,000 hardcover, and the paperback is up to almost 2 million.
Now your works are a group called the Earth series.
Earth's Children series, yes. Basically what happened is that I started with an idea for what I thought was going to be a short story.
Now people have accused me of being long-winded, but
no. Basically, it was a prehistoric time of a young girl living with people who were less developed, more primitive than she, and living with an old man with a crippled arm and looked upon with suspicion and as odd. I started to do some research on it, basically library research to begin with, and discovered this whole world, this whole complex, rich, diverse world that I didn't know existed before. And I just got so carried away and so excited about it, and I sat down and I after I read the first probably 50 books that I pulled out of the library, and the story idea had grown and expanded, and I thought I was going to have a novel. And I sat down, and never written before, and I sat at the typewriter and I started to write, and it came up for air about, 6 months later, and this huge manuscript, and it had fallen into 6 parts. And I thought at that time it was going to be part 1, part 2, part 3 of one novel. And then I went back and read it, and it was awful. It stunk. It was the worst. My feeling, my passion, my story was not on that page. So I went back to the library and got books on how to write fiction. And I really started to teach myself the process. I've been a reader all my life, so it's not as though I wasn't familiar with it. But then when I went back and I started to rewrite this, I realized that I didn't have one novel in 6 parts. I had 6 novels. I had researched too much. I had too much to tell. You cannot in one novel have hundreds of characters and encompass the entire continent of Ice Age prehistoric Europe. And so I know that I have 6 books, and The Valley of Horses is the second. It is a series. It follows the main character, Ayla, her lifetime. It's not a generational saga, but I'm using her story in effect to show, to make a fictional story about some of these very complex and interesting cultures that I've read about.
And by the time we're through with all 6 of yours, we'll know a little bit about prehistoric man.
Well, I'm certainly learning a great deal. And I have gotten in general, very good responses from the academic community, considering that I'm not an anthropologist, I'm not an archaeologist, I'm a novelist. I hope I'm a novelist who's done her homework well. I do know that the Clan of the Cave Bear is being used by many universities in archaeology and anthropology and in sociology and psychology and so on for either recommended readings, supplemental reading, or in some cases required reading.
That's a pretty nice feather in your cap if you can be a successful bestseller and accurate enough that the universities will use you.
Well, I think what they're feeling is the thing that I wanted to do, which was to add that element of humanity, to make it come alive. These are people, these are our ancestors, they're human. They're not grunting savages. They really have, the artifacts show that these cultures were so much more complex than we've imagined.
We'll be back in a moment, and Jean will show us some slides that show some of the animals and some of the paintings that she chose to write about. My guest is Jean Auel, and she's the author of Valley of the Horses and Clan of the Cave Bear. Jean, you did extensive research for your books, and you brought some slides that shows us a little bit about what you're writing about.
Well, the period in time is 30,000 years ago.
All right.
This was the time of the Ice Age. Woolly mammoths were roaming the earth. That is a reconstruction from a museum in Brno, Czechoslovakia.
But now that is a large animal.
Well, it's not as large as a mastodon, though, that was in this country. There was because of the cold climate, there was a sense of compactness. It's about the size of an elephant, but it was furry. It had an undercoat of soft down and an outer coat. And of course, they have found some frozen mammoths in Siberia. And the fur was like 20 inches long on the outer coat, just long strands of hair.
I think, now what are
Now,
those?
the people who lived in that part of the world, because this was the Ice Age, open steppes, open grassland, not very many trees, they constructed dwellings using the mammoth bones as the structural members of the houses, of the dwellings. They didn't have trees. They even learned to burn bone of mammoth for fuel.
That's incredible. It takes such a high temperature to burn bone.
That's exactly true. How they know this is they discovered, for example, that underneath the fireplaces there is a trench that leads to the outside of the dwelling. And because of the conditions set up by the glacier, the wind is blowing out there. The wind would be brought in to the fireplace, in effect creating a forced air fireplace, which created a hot enough fire to cause bone to burn.
So 30,000 years ago, they were harnessing the weather.
That's a wonderful way to put it. That is a drawing on a cave wall at Rouffignac in France of a woolly mammoth. And that's one that's one way that we know what they looked like. We also know, and I will tell you that in the south of France today, there are no woolly mammoths. This is another animal. This is what is called a giant deer or an Irish elk. And this is the rack. This is the antlers. And they were, in some cases, 11 feet. Just tremendous animals. And this was, again, a deer that was a plains-dwelling animal. And when the glacier melted and the trees came back, then the deer disappeared. This is, again, on a cave wall in France from Lascaux. And you can tell that these people were expert artists. Look at the perspective. Look at the sense of coloring. Look at the shape of the animal, of the feet, of the hoofs, of the legs in the front. This was done somewhere around 30,000 years ago. This is our caveman ancestors.
These are the dummies that
these are the groping savages. That is a stone lamp. It was made by the people who lived there. If you're going to paint in a cave, you've got to have light. I mean, those are dark, cold, damp caves, right? How are you going to, I mean, they didn't have floodlights. They have to have some way to light them. They've looked, they have found no traces of smoke on the ceiling, so they know there was no fireplaces. What they did was they took a lamp out of stone. They took a piece of tallow, which is basically animal fat that has been rendered in boiling water, and they put a lump of it in the lamp and put a little wick of moss or lichen or something, and it would burn without smoke.
And this is in the hollow of a stone.
And this is in the hollow of a stone, or they would either carve it. Sometimes they just find a natural stone that had a kind of a saucer shape in it.
It's incredible. Now you're going to switch, and this is an artifacts that that's going to come up here. No, we're not going to see that? I guess we're not going to see that. You have pictures of the goddess figure.
Oh yes, as a matter of fact, I have a replica on. The period in time was noted for one thing in among others, and that was replicas of women figurines with the mother elements emphasized. They call them like the Venus of Vestinies, the Venus of Willendorf. They're not really Venuses. I think that they were probably symbolic of mother.
Well,
And
why
there
don't we
have-
take a pause and we'll come right back and we'll talk further about the mother figures in the Ice Age. Now is my guest this evening. She's the author of Valley of Horses. We've been talking about prehistoric man. Let's talk about prehistoric woman.
Good idea. This is a replica that my husband had made for me. It is a replica of a figure that is termed the Venus of Willendorf, except she's really more of a mother figure. And the elements of woman, of the breast and the buttocks and the stomach, are what is enlarged, or not even enlarged, but just emphasized. Actually, this particular figure has been examined by doctors. The original resides in a museum in Austria. She is about 4 inches high. She's made out of limestone, and she's anatomically correct for a woman of her proportions, except they have purposely de-emphasized the arms and the legs.
And the face.
And the face doesn't show. They don't show that it's either a knob or it's a decoration. They have found these literally from the Atlantic seaboard to Siberia. There have been hundreds of them. I've seen hundreds of them in my trip to Europe last summer. I've seen photographs of them long before that. I believe that they are in some way symbolic of woman, of mother. They all sort of date to this period in time, about 30,000 years ago. I think it also is an interesting idea when you consider the fact this is caveman, this is the Ice Age, and yet here is this same consistency through this whole period of time across the entire continent. And it's not a great deal of difference. There's these same elements, the fact that the woman's body, the mother elements of them are shown, the arms and legs are de-emphasized. They often just have little peg feet like that, almost as though the originals might have been stuck on the ground.
Well, there was so much emphasis on breeding, fertility, because the race was going to die if they didn't.
I'm not too sure so much of that. I just think that there must have been a sense of wonder about the creation of life. Where does life come from? We still think of birth as a miracle, and we know a great deal about it in medical terms. In those days, perhaps the whole idea that a woman brings forth children may have had far more emphasis and meaning. And it may have had some relationship to the animals, because the caves are painted with animals. It's interesting that as beautifully as they can make women figurines, as beautifully and as carefully and as correctly as they can make animals, you see very few actual human figures. No males to speak of. When they do show them, they either have masks on, or their faces are caricatures, or they're called anthropomorphs, and they are not either male or female. It's like they couldn't show a human.
Maybe it's perhaps like in the Middle East, if you want to take a picture of many of the people, especially the very religious, conservative, old-line people, they won't let you because they feel it's an affront to God to show their picture, to take their face on a picture.
Now, who knows? I mean, of course, I'm a novelist, and so I'm going to get to explore the idea. I'm going to get to come up with an idea that feels consistent with the storyline that I've developed.
What was the role of woman during those times besides
mother and life and miracle? And one of the interesting things that very often, I mean, we can't know for sure. What we can do is we can take a sidestep and look at today's people who are hunting gathering people, or were up until recent times. When we take a look, for example, at hunting gathering societies around the world, we find that the woman's contribution in many cases, her gathering efforts contributed as much as 80% to the food that the community ate. Now you know that is a major economic contribution to that society, and her worth is not undervalued, because very often the older anthropologists in earlier days looked at the so-called primitive societies from their own ethnocentric point of view. And they would look at it and they'd say, well, here's a woman doing women kind of things, having babies and so on. Obviously, she must be a second-class citizen. While within her own society, she may not have been considered that at all. It was just the viewpoint of the anthropologist who was looking at that society.
Interesting point. Never thought of that. We'll be back in a moment. Jean Auel is my guest. She's the author of Valley of Horses. It's number 3 right now on the New York Times bestseller list. But I want to talk about how you got to a famous author, a best-selling author. How did you start out?
I have to say one thing. I still find myself, when you say famous author, I want to go, oh, where?
Where?
You know, who? I'll give you a quickie thumbnail biography, okay? I got married when I was 18. I was born in Chicago. I got married when I was 18. I moved to New Mexico, lived there for 2 years because my husband was in the Air Force and stationed at Roswell. And when he was discharged, we went to Oregon. By the time I was 25, I had 5 children. And when I was 28, I decided I wanted to go back to school. I wanted to do more with myself. And I wanted to learn something I didn't know anything about. So I literally went to school and took math. I mean, I have algebra, trigonometry, analytical geometry, calculus, differential equations, physics, and electronics. I started working full-time at this electronics company. It's near Portland, Oregon, called Tektronix. I started in clerical work. I was a key punch operator. I moved into engineering. I became a designer of printed circuit boards. Then I decided the world of business was open for me, and I managed to get into a master's degree program in business administration and went through management training programs at the company. And suddenly here I was at the ripe old age of 40. I had an MBA. I'd gotten it in May of that year, 1976. I was a credit manager. And in November of that year, I quit. And I don't know why I quit my job. I mean, I just was not really sure that was what after I'd worked very hard to get that education. I was raising my kids. I was, going to school and doing all of these things. Suddenly, here I quit my job. And I had 3 daughters in college at the time, and I had 2 sons in high school. And suddenly, I was sort of in this free-floating state. It was like I had no more school. I mean, I got my degree. There's no point in going back to school. I had no more homework. I had no more work because I had quit. I have almost grown kids. And I didn't know what I wanted to do. And I thought, oh, certainly I've got to use this education. I mean, I went to school and did all these things. And one day, I think it was early in '77, around the end of January, I got this funny idea for a story that I mentioned about this girl living with these people. And I sat down and started to write it and I realized really quickly, 2 things. I've been a closet poet for about 10 years, and I still am a closet poet. I write poetry for myself. But once I sat down and started to write this, I discovered it was fun. I had never done anything that was so much fun. I mean, not that it's not hard work, but I'll tell you, I have had more fun since I was 40, and I'm 47 now, than I've ever had in my life. I sat down, I started to write it, I was grabbed by it, I realized I didn't know what I was writing about. That led me into the research, and the research led me into more, and pretty soon there I was all wrapped up in this thing, and here I am with finally, 2 years down the road, I've got a finished manuscript. What am I going to do with it? I don't know the first thing about the publishing industry. But I had, gone to the library, gotten some books on how to get published. I don't know what I'd do without libraries, And I had started to send off sample chapters and queries and so on to publishers and getting rejections. And back in '77, when I had finally made the decision that I really wanted to write this story, I had joined a local writers club in Portland, Oregon, and this is mostly aspiring writers. It's not the kind of a club where you read each other's work. It's more, you go to a meeting and you associate with other people who are writing, and you get speakers in, and they also have a writers' conference. And writers' conferences are wonderful. They bring in people from the publishing industry, like agents and editors. And there had been an agent back in '77 at that conference, and I'd gotten her business card. So here, 2 years later, or 2.5 years later, after I'd gotten several rejects, I thought, maybe I ought to try this agent. I sent her a letter. She said,
do you remember me?
I did a little of that. I did. I'll tell you, I spent 2 weeks writing the best query letter, the best sales letter. I had no writing credentials. I had no anthropology credentials. All I tried to do was interest her in this subject, in this story that I'd written, this piece of fiction set, you know, about caveman, right? She said, it sounds interesting, send me the manuscript. And then she believed in it. And she believed in it to such an extent that she did something that people don't usually do, especially agents don't do. She put herself on the line. She said, I'm going to have an auction. I think this book warrants. I think it's got the potential to really do wonderful things. People are going to like to read it. And she held an auction, carefully selecting which publisher and which editor. And I will tell you that I almost was knocked over when she called me and said that she had gotten an advance of $130,000. And I mean, it's not usual. And that was the beginning. And magic has happened since then.
How does your family take to your success?
Well, they seem to be, you know, my mother, the author. You know, it's, my children are pretty well scattered. I have a daughter in Baltimore, and I have a daughter in Hawaii, and one in Eugene, and a son in Portland, and another son in Anaheim. They do things like they go into the bookstores and they take and put mother's books in front of all the other books.
say, oh, that's a good book. I've read it. Why don't you try it? My guest has been Jean Auel. Thank you for joining me.